Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. With the end of the Donald Trump presidency, is America First dead? Let's get to the bottom line. Back when Donald Trump was campaigning for president 5 years ago, millions of Americans clicked in to his America First talk. When he kept talking about how the United States was getting a raw deal from the rest of the world, they got it. Many felt like they had fought the Cold War, they'd made sacrifices, and China had won. But President-elect Joe Biden, in contrast, is not an America Firster. He says he wants to get back to traditional multilateralism and give big hugs to the UN and the World Health Organization, the WTO, and those Paris Climate Accords. But there are some critics of President Trump who say he wasn't talking about America First at all. He was talking about Trump First. And one of those famous critics, who's neither a big believer in multilateral foreign policy nor Trump First foreign policy, is our guest today. For decades, John Bolton has been on the world stage working for Republican administrations, and he was Trump's national security advisor for more than a year. Trump tried to quash the publication of Ambassador Bolton's book, The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir. Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for joining us today. What I want my viewers to get a sense of is the code, the scaffolding, the infrastructure of what a John Bolton American foreign policy would look like. And Donald Trump has talked a lot about America First. In my book, you're the America First guy. What are the key elements of that as you see it?
Well, I think in Trump's mind, he didn't really have a particular picture. He had themes and notions that he thought would be politically popular, and he followed through on some of them. I mean, my view of American foreign policy in broad principles hasn't changed in many years. I would call it Reaganite. I would call it a belief in peace through strength. I would say it rests on a very strong America that acts as a deterrence to hostile actions by others. But it's an America that believes that the best way to protect American society at home and to increase liberty and prosperity here is to have a strong international presence around the world. And that it goes in both directions. You can't have that strong American presence without a strong domestic economy and a vibrant society. You cannot pull away from the rest of the world. You cannot drift back into isolationism. But by the same token, you can't delegate responsibility for protecting America to others. If we're not capable of doing it ourselves, nobody else is going to do it for us.
What is your North Star in that when you deal with such an unpredictable president that you were serving like Donald Trump?
Well, that's a very good question because I don't think we succeeded very well. I think a president to be successful in the international sphere in particular has to have focus and concentration, has to lay out what the objectives are that he seeks so that his subordinates clearly understand what his priorities are, and then is willing to apply himself and do the work necessary to carry through on them. I'd have to say, as an example, that Barack Obama and George W. Bush, to take two very different presidents, both worked hard at doing the job. And that enabled their subordinates at the top levels and all the way down to be able to follow through. Whether you like the policies or not, methodologically, I think that they committed to doing the work that was necessary to make sure that their policies could be achieved. But Donald Trump had none of that, and it may seem completely counterintuitive, but he didn't really fully understand, and I don't think to this day understands what it means to be president. That obviously makes it hard, if not impossible, to pursue policies effectively. And it was a constant issue for all of us, even when, for example, I might be disagreeing with Jim Mattis or Mike Pompeo. I don't think we had a very different view of the difficulty of a president who didn't really pay attention.
Well, thank you for that. One of the things that you've been very animated on over the years is Iran, and very critical of the Obama administration, the JCPOA negotiating Iran. And now, just today, I mean, there was a Washington Post piece that came out and said, there's 12 times the nuclear material that could lead to Iran have the capacity to create a couple of warheads. I guess what I'm trying to fix is, I know your views on Iran and its its leadership. Would there have been any kind of deal with that regime that you would have been satisfied for? Or are there ways to take that kind of deal, like I think President Trump was interested in, and get something that your part of the foreign policy universe could live with?
Well, I'll just speak personally. I don't see that the regime in Tehran is capable of engaging in behavior across the wide range of activity that we would need to have confidence that it would lead to a peaceful and secure Middle East, because it's not just the nuclear and ballistic missile programs. And in fact, leaving aside the merits or demerits of the 2015 deal, part of the problem is the deal itself provided Iran with the wherewithal to increase its terrorist activity, its support for terrorist activity, and its conventional military activities around the region, thus increasing the threat, particularly to those in the neighborhood. I think that this is a good example of a regime that's so fundamentally opposed to the kinds of logics that we see and are able to deal with in more traditional adversaries, that the only recourse, I think, ultimately for us to be safe is a different kind of regime in Iran. And what's striking, and what I think will confront the Biden administration with a real problem, is that within the region itself, I think that view is now more and more widely shared, even by traditional allies or adversaries like Israel and the Gulf Arab states. And I think this very different strategic arrangement in the region is going to make it harder for the Biden administration to recreate a JCPOA 2.0, even if that's what they still want to do.
One time when President Trump went to South Korea, I think it was his first trip, I was up at 3 in the morning watching his speech that he was giving from a U.S. military base there. And it was all very good. It was, he was reading from the teleprompter until he got to the end. And he began riffing on this base, that he could have built the base cheaper, he could have built it under budget, and the base wasn't really for America's security anyway, it was only for Korea. And with that moment, you could tell that he had undermined the entire reason for going in the eyes of many of the sort of strategic class around him, which was to communicate that South Korea's and that Asian security was wedged into American security. And you weren't there at that moment, but this is so much a part of Donald Trump, which I know you must not agree with, which is withdrawing from alliances, kicking allies in the teeth on a lot of things. I'd love to get you. That was all very clear before you became his national security advisor. Did you not see these things about him?
Well, I certainly heard that and many other things that he said that I disagreed with before I went in. But I believe that inevitably the weight of the responsibilities of the presidency, the gravity of the issues that the president has to deal with would affect Trump the same way they did every other American president. And I turned out to be wrong about that. He never realized the gravity of the issues he was dealing with. And in many ways, my book is the story of how I was wrong in that assessment. But I also didn't really think that he was so transactional that he could look at alliances and say at the end of every year you're going to tote up your assets and your liabilities, and if on December 31st they're not exactly equal, maybe the alliance is over. I strongly believe that the U.S. allies across the board can do more to participate, do more in terms of spending and other effort to pull their weight in our alliance structure. The NATO allies agreed to spend 2% of gross domestic product on defense by 2024. Many of them aren't close to it and aren't going to make it. I think that's a real problem, and I think it hurts in domestic American circles when we can't say our allies really are carrying their fair share of the burden. But I see this as a problem in having a weakening effect on the alliance, which I would like to see stronger, whereas Trump, in this totally transactional way of his, I think would not shed a tear if NATO disappeared, if he pulled forces out of South Korea or Japan, and just generally reduced America's presence in the world. Now, thank goodness we're not going to find out whether my fears are correct here. He did lose the election. That is, to me, as clear as can be, and we will have a Biden administration, which doesn't make me happy either. But at least we're not going to risk further damage to the alliance structures around the world that we have because of Trump's view.
Look, I know you're not a fan of Joe Biden, but I mean, when you wrote your book and you had the tussle with the administration, I think I tweeted something along the way. I said, John Bolton may in fact be the reason why Donald Trump loses eventually. You have a lot of followers. You once thought about running for president. You have a lot of people that follow your brand of foreign policy and national security. And so, when you lose by a little, everything is the reason. Do you think you in part contributed to President Trump's defeat?
Sure, why not take credit for it? I don't see how it can hurt. I mean, I did write the book in part for people to read and make up their minds when you have the opportunity to serve as I did and see the problems that a Trump administration creates. If you don't tell your contemporaries, I think you're doing a disservice. But I didn't write the book just because it has my opinions or judgments in it. I really wrote it to try and be as factual, as accurate as I could for others to read it and draw their own conclusions. And it'll be there for the historians too, but mostly it's for American citizens to say, is this really what we want in a presidency?
Look, if I had one school of foreign policy thought that I sort of thought that I was part of, it's a kind of Nixonian realist school. I believe in talking to troubling, difficult thugs around the world because they're important and they help govern things. But Donald Trump took it to the, as you called it, being buddies with autocrats, being buddies with Kim Jong Un, Vladimir Putin, even with our trouble with China with Xi Jinping in this. And I guess as you got to know him, with one line in the book that really surprised me is that you said you never asked Donald Trump what he thought about Vladimir Putin because you were almost afraid of what he might say. So I guess my question is, what do you think in your time spent with President Trump, explains why he has so much disdain for almost all Democratic leaders, except perhaps Abe and Japan, but that he really runs towards and wants to be counted amongst these autocrats?
Well, there are a lot of theories on that. I'm not a shrink myself. I'll leave those theories to others. I think he's drawn to the autocrats because in the Trump world they look like winners. They're not constantly harassed by aides and allies, and their options aren't limited. They sort of do what they want to do. If you're Vladimir Putin and you don't like somebody, there are ways to deal with them in Russia as there are in China. Whereas Democratic leaders are inherently more restrained or constrained, I guess would be a better way to say it. And Trump obviously wishes he were not constrained. That's why what we've gone through since the election has been so trying for many of us, that he just does not understand that the interest of Donald Trump do not overcome the Constitution and these other technicalities. So I think it's he wants to be a winner. That's clear. He doesn't want to be a loser. He sees the autocrats as being more in the category of winners, which is generally true right up in time until the time they're overthrown by popular revolutions, which will come in many of these countries, no doubt.
You say that President Trump is out, that Joe Biden will be coming in. President Trump doesn't seem to be giving up yet. But I guess in the aftermath of this, I know you have a super PAC. You've supported a lot of members for both the House and the Senate. And if I may, they range from sort of moderate deal makers, pragmatists, to hardliners on various issues in the party. Are you going to try to come back into the Republican Party to restore health to it, bring it back into what John Bolton at least thinks it ought to be, or are you going to step away from this until Donald Trump is far away?
Well, I'm afraid he's never going to go far away. I think that's part of the problem for the Republican Party. What I've tried to do over the years is focus on Republicans who believe in a strong American foreign policy. I've been less concerned about their views on domestic issues. But I think now it's very clear that the Republican Party needs to have a real conversation about what it wants to be in the post-Trump era. Now, part of our problem is we can't seem to get to the post-Trump era yet, but I will certainly do what I can to move that along. My preference really is to go back to a Reaganite view. It's a belief in essentially a free society domestically, as free as we can make it, liberating the people for their own creative activities, whatever they may be. Very strong America internationally, to make sure that we're not threatened by others. And also to remember that Reagan was optimistic and forward looking. He believed in morning in America. He believed in the shining city on the hill. He did not talk about American carnage the way Donald Trump does. Now, look, attitude isn't going to triumph over hard reality, but I think we know the kinds of policies that the party believes in, and I think the point that can't be stressed enough is that for conservatives that I know, we got involved in politics because of philosophy and policy. We didn't get involved in it because of personalities. Personalities shouldn't define the Republican Party any more than they should define the Democratic Party. It should be about ideas. And that's the kind of party that we need fundamentally.
When I read your book, it sounds like where the media was doing. When I read your book, you sound like some of the Democrats, not all of them, because there are some Democrats who see the world closely along the way you do. And I'm just wondering, is that just John Bolton, permanent Republican, or do you see some merit in some of the criticisms and observations that the media was bringing to this, and also to a certain degree some Democrats who are now coming into office?
Well, I think some of the criticisms of Trump from the Democrats and the media were correct in terms of methodology, style, approach, and that sort of thing. And what I was trying to do in the passages in the book that I think you're referring to is explain that you can actually be a conservative and not be Donald Trump. In fact, I would say being a conservative almost by definition means you're not Donald Trump. And I think many in the media didn't see that. Many in the Democratic Party didn't see it. They simply criticized Trump for everything. And in fact, in many cases where they had a grain of truth in the criticism, it got exaggerated to the point that it was impossible to find common ground on it. So I found that irritating because on the inside, what I was trying to do is persuade the president toward policies that I would consider more typically Republican mainstream. And then these attacks would come in, and among many other things that would divert Donald Trump's attention, that they would certainly succeed.
You had a very powerful end of the book that I was surprised by and hadn't heard largely discussed in the press. There were a lot of criticism of you for not stepping up to voluntarily testify, if you will, both in the impeachment process in the House, and you were following the legal processes with Charles Kupperman and where that came out. But people said, why not stand up and do this? And what you wrote is something which I found interesting. You said, look, that you already saw the writing on the wall, that the way that the legal challenge on Trump had been narrowly defined was one where you knew where it was going to come out. It was hardly worth playing. But that there were larger issues about Trump and selling out essentially America's interests in a much larger context that may have been high crimes and high crimes and may have been impeachable. Did I get that right? Were you basically saying, had they gone bigger, you would have been there and probably supportive?
Yeah, I don't think they thought through what they were trying to do. And I think by the time, when I resigned on September the 10th, 2019, I had to get my life back together. People from the National Security Council were coming and dismantling the skiff in my basement. The impeachment effort was well underway, and I thought it was doomed to failure. It was too narrow. It was pursued in a partisan way. And I felt that the Senate, that there was simply no chance of a Senate conviction. Now, that might not have been possible in any circumstances, but here was the basic mistake that the impeachment advocates made. They thought, as Nancy Pelosi famously said, Trump will be impeached forever. Okay, true. But he was also acquitted forever by the Senate. Does that, in your mind, say that he's going to be limited and constrained and deterred by the impeachment process in a second term, or would he have been emboldened and enabled? I think the answer is clearly the latter. And in that sense, the impeachment effort achieved a result exactly the opposite of what the impeachment advocates favored. And the whole thing was so misbegotten in my mind that I just didn't see it as ultimately as being productive. I also thought it was important to tell the full story, which is what I tried to do in the book, although I could have written much more. People need to see it whole. And obviously in impeachment in Congress, testimony is going to be very inadequate to accomplish that. So I understand why people feel the way they do. I just don't think they fully appreciate the bigger picture. At least that's the point I was trying to make.
I'm interested after an 18-year now long Afghanistan war, after a period where clearly a lot of Americans are exhausted of that kind of conflict. Do you think, have you rethought any of this? Do you think that those kinds of wars are, that we're still on the course and need to have them, to have that conflict with Iran to get it moved on, to have that kind of conflict to move in North Korea? Because those both came out in your book as well. You said we can't shirk that responsibility, and there are ways to go in. And I think that's also part of the John Bolton package.
Yeah, well, I think the war in Afghanistan is very different from the threats of proliferation posed by North Korea and Iran. And the point I've always tried to make in the proliferation context is I don't think America should allow its innocent civilian populations to be held hostage by rogue regimes that pursue ideologies and are governed by personalities that don't follow our logic. They are governed by their own logic, to be sure. It just doesn't happen to be ours. And to leave our civilians and the civilians of our allies held at risk by regimes like that, I find unacceptable. Now, every American president in recent history has said it's unacceptable for Iran and North Korea to get nuclear weapons. And yet, with North Korea, we're on the verge of it, and Iran is itself close. Do they really think it's unacceptable or not? And so what I've said really is nothing different than what the Bush 43 administration policy on preemption in certain circumstances was. And I think that's something the would-be nuclear proliferators need to understand, that that's a consequence they could face. That is the sort of pressure that could affect their behavior in very dramatic ways.
Let me just ask in conclusion, Ambassador, with the Biden administration coming in, what do you fear will be their biggest mistakes that you would warn them as a friend, as someone who cares about the nation? These are the biggest landmines that you could run into as you give them counsel, and hopefully you're all talking together somewhere.
Don't count on it. Look, there are a lot of things I could say. Let me just say one. I think China is the existential threat for the United States and the West as a whole in the 21st century. I don't necessarily paint it as a Cold War II. It has aspects of the Cold War, but it also has aspects of 19th century power politics. China is obviously pursuing a domestic society very different from ours, but its behavior in the political, military, and economic spheres internationally is hostile, if not belligerent. I think we have been late to catch up to what China is doing. I think the coronavirus actually has educated a lot of Americans and a lot of Europeans too to the kind of society the regime in Beijing runs and the kind of threat that poses to the rest of us. We see in public opinion surveys attitudes hardening against China in both the U.S. and Europe. And I think the Biden administration really needs to think through across the board, not just on tariff issues or cyber security issues or conventional military issues, across the board. How are you going to deal with China? Because the Chinese, to their credit, are master strategists. They think in long periods, comprehensively, whole of government, and we can respond in bits and pieces, which is what we're doing now, with some success, and I think in the right direction in many cases. But we have not thought through the big picture the way the Chinese have. So before the incoming Biden administration takes too many decisions that are hard to reverse, I think they need to think through the bigger picture. I think we would welcome a discussion of that in Congress. This is nothing that the Trump administration ever had the capability of doing. And I think if we don't do it now, we may be hard-pressed to do it in the future.
Well, Ambassador John Bolton, author of The Room Where It Happened, I could talk with you for hours. I don't know if you would like that, but we could do this another time. Thank you so much for joining us today. Fascinating to discuss war and peace with you.
Well, thanks again for having me.
So what's the bottom line? There's a big fight in Washington over how to position America in the world and what its objectives should be and how to pursue them. Some, like my guest today, are skeptical of global deals and institutions, and others, like many coming into the new Biden administration, believe America's goals are enhanced by those global deals. More importantly, right now, is the fact that there is a big trust deficit in the United States, its dependability, and its actual capacity to deliver to allies. That's why it's important to understand that Biden's goals may be worthy for the US and the world, but it's John Bolton's more cynical assessment that may be closer to what actually unfolds in the years ahead. And that's the bottom line.